Welcome everyone to this webinar. We are happy to have Dr. Brian Weeden, the Director of Programs at the Secure World Foundation. Brian will tell us a bit more about the foundation, but suffice it to say that it's one of the leading voices and agents in space sustainability. And of course, Brian is involved in most of these efforts, including serving as the Executive Director of CONFERS. We are here to discuss space sustainability, which definitely I don't think is new to many of us here. But perhaps we could say it's actually a buzzword now, and it's even gotten the attention of the UN General Assembly. But today, Brian will just give us an overview of how the concept has evolved over the years, and in particular, the increasing role of the private sector. Now, there are several frameworks that are in existence, both from the UN-led, from private organizations. But the question still remains, how do we move from just drafting these frameworks and then begin to take specific actions, specific steps or strategies towards achieving space sustainability? Before I call on Brian, let me just say a few words about the African Space Leadership Institute, which is hosting this event. ASLI, as you call it, is Africa's first space-focused think tank. Our core objectives are just threefold. One, to develop Africa's capacity in space policy, space law, and space governance. Secondly, to strengthen Africa's participation in international forums, forums where issues like space sustainability are discussed, and to kind of put forward African positions and kind of advise even African governments on what positions to take. And thirdly, which is kind of very important, is to support space programs in Africa, actually to kind of make them more sustainable rather than just one-off programs, as it were. We pursue this objective through organizing courses, webinars, roundtable discussions, public lectures, amongst other things. And I'll just mention just three that are just coming up in not too long from now. First, we have the Global Space Policy course, which is starting in March. Some of us may have seen the advert around. And I think the unique thing about that course is the not just the international facilitators, but also we use this comparative public policy pedagogy, where you'll see how space policy is developed in different countries and compare with others and see what lessons can be learned. Secondly, in May, we are having what is going to be the very first colloquium on the African Outer Space Program. Some of us may be aware, the African Outer Space Program is one of the flagship programs of the African Union. And so it's good for us to see how far the continent has come. The program was initiated as far back as 2013, and this is about 10 years now. So where is the continent with respect to the program? And of course, we also look at it from at the national level too, the kind of programs that are going on at the national level and how they fit into the continental space program. So that will come up in May. You're still welcome to submit abstracts if you want to join us in that discussion. The deadline for submitting abstracts, it's next week, 31st of January. And then finally for now is to mention the second Adigun Ade Abiodun public lecture. As some of us may know, Adigun Ade Abiodun, he was formerly the United Nations expert on space applications and later served as the chairman of CONFERS. So we started this lecture series last year in honor of Dr. Abiodun. And last year we had Professor Max Hoffman deliver the lecture. This year, we are happy that Dr. Peter Martinez, who is the Executive Director of Space Secure Foundation, will be delivering the lecture. So that's going to come up in September 26th. So please, you can mark your calendars for that event also. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to Brian for his talk. Brian is going to talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes. And then after that, we have Q&A and interact with Brian. So welcome, Brian. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Sounds like a great lineup of events coming up through this year. I'm happy to say that I had the honor of meeting Ade a few times and working with him a little bit in the COPUOS context. Great guy. So thank you all for attending. As Ade said in his very good introduction, what I want to talk about today is to go through sort of a little bit of the journey we've been on with space sustainability. Obviously, it's not a new term for many people in the audience, and it's growing in terms of public awareness. But now we're in the phase where that is sort of mission accomplished on raising awareness. How do we go from awareness to action? And so what I want to talk about today is sort of a recap of why we care so much about space sustainability. And then, as Ade mentioned, I want to talk through some of the initiatives that have been proposed or have been going on, both at the multilateral governmental level and in the private sector, to try and address some of these issues. Then I'm going to close with a discussion of some of the remaining challenges. For those who have not heard of us yet, Secure World Foundation, we are a private operating foundation, and our main focus is on cooperative solutions for space sustainability. We work with a lot of different governments, industry, international organizations, and civil society. We are based here in the United States. I work in Washington, D.C. We also have a headquarters in Colorado, but we do a lot of engagement with the United Nations. We do a lot of engagement with different countries around the world. I'm actually headed next week to the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is where a lot of this discussions are happening at the multilateral level. I also want to start with just a quick discussion of what do we mean by space sustainability, because as that term and that phrase has been discussed more, I'll say there's a lot of different interpretations of what that is. So for us, space sustainability is that box at the bottom, right? How do we continue to find new ways of using space for benefits on Earth into the future? And that sort of encapsulates two things. One, it says, look, at the moment, there's lots of stuff that's happening in space. We've got more countries, more companies that are putting on more and more satellites and that are coming up with new ways to use space that have a wide variety of benefits, everything from providing communications and weather and monitoring the environment, new science. But as that usage grows, there are what economists would call negative externalities that have impacts, and they could impact everyone. And at the moment, there are some basic rules and a governance framework for space, but the change in the new actors and in the new uses and the expanding use is happening quite fast, and in many cases faster than the governance system is adapting. So for us, it's not about stopping what we're doing in space, because we get so many benefits, and there's going to be so many new benefits that are going to be coming. It's about how do we manage all these new activities and these new action space and this new innovation to mitigate those externalities. That for us, that is how we define space sustainability. So I want to go through some of the current reasons why we care. The first is there's a lot more stuff in space that humans are putting up there. The top chart here shows how many objects are in space by the 5 countries that have the most. You can see the United States at top with active satellites, nearly 6,500. That is almost entirely commercial satellites, and a huge percentage of that is one company, SpaceX, and we'll talk a bit more of that in a minute. And then you've got China with just around 850, the United Kingdom about 670, and again, the vast majority of that is one company and one constellation, called OneWeb. Russia has about 260 and Japan about 100. These are active, functioning satellites delivering a mission. And on the right-hand side, you can see each of those countries' share of debris. Some interesting things. Countries like China and Russia have far more debris objects on orbit than they do current active satellites. That used to be the case for the United States until Starlink came around, and now the United States have much more active satellites than debris. If you go down to the bottom, just talking about the debris, so these are the dead things floating around that are posing a hazard. There's roughly 20,000 things bigger than 10 centimeters. These are sometimes very large, the size of buses, And if they're hit or they collide, they can generate lots of new debris. There's close to 1 million between 1 and 10 centimeters, and that can cause major damage in a collision. And then things smaller than that, there's a lot of them, and we don't really have a good number or way to handle them, and they can all cause minor damage. This chart captures how radical the change has been in the last 3 or 4 years. You can see there was roughly 100 or so satellites at most launched into space every year up until the mid 2010s, and that leaped to a few hundred. And then in the 2020s, that has leaped to 1,000 or 2,000 satellites being launched per year. I think many people have heard of the very well-known and famous Kessler syndrome. This chart sort of captures that. What it says is that, and this study was done in 2008, that if we did not do anything, there would be a growth in the amount of debris due to collisions between all the existing things on orbit. And of course, things have not stayed the same, right? We have put up thousands of more satellites. So this is the big thing that a lot of people are concerned about. Now I will note, look at the timeline on the bottom. This is not a scenario that happens in 1 year or even 5 years. This is a 200-year simulation. So it is very similar to climate change in that we're talking about large effects that accumulate over a long period of time, not necessarily like a very quick reaction, chemical reaction that happens as a result of one incident. In terms of those new things, the biggest change is the birth of large constellations. This is a concept that was thought about and people tried to make happen in the 1990s. Microsoft had some investments and some other things, and it didn't go anywhere because the cost and technology wasn't quite ready. Now it is. You can see at the top 2 lines on here, the first generation OneWeb. There are now 640 of those that have been launched into space. And then that third line, the first generation Starlink, has a little more than 4,000 that have been launched. And then the fourth line, the second generation, part 1, so 2A of Starlink, there have now been about 1,700 of those launched. And while that seems like quite a lot, keep in mind the total planned. There's yet another generation of Starlink that is planned to have 22,000. There are several other constellations in here of 1,000. There's 2 different Chinese constellations that are planned to have about 13,000 satellites. And then there's a constellation called Cinnamon or eSpace that has been filed through Rwanda that has asked for permission for over 300,000 satellites. So this is what is planned and might be coming down the pipeline. This is just an image of the current Starlink constellation, and this is why they need so many satellites. If you want to provide, good, fast, low latency, broadband internet access around the world, which is a beneficially good thing for millions of people around the world that can't otherwise get it, you need a lot of satellites to always make sure you have several satellites overhead. And if you ever go to that link at the bottom, satellite-map.space, it gives you a live image of the current Starlink constellation. You can put in your country. You can see what's overhead. It's a really fascinating application. In addition to the physical congestion that I was just talking about, large objects, there's also a huge amount of challenge happening in the radio frequency congestion. There is only one radio frequency spectrum that the entire globe uses, and we use it for a lot of different purposes. This is one small snapshot of an absolutely immense graphic showing the current allocations for different uses of satellite spectrum. This only shows the spectrum between 35.5 and 51.4 gigahertz. And you can see even in that very small slice, you see there are mobile cell services, you see there are scientific, there's television and radio broadcasting, there's science, there's satellite to ground communications, there's radio astronomy, there's radio navigation, i.e. GPS, BeiDou, Galileo. There is a huge amount of different applications all sharing this same spectrum. And as we continue both our activities in space and terrestrially, this is becoming a huge problem. In fact, the International Telecommunications Union, which is the global multinational body that manages and allocates all those spectrum assignments, just had their every 4-year meeting called the World Radio Communication Conference. And space was a huge part of that. There were many, many debates that were happening in the 4 weeks of the Work 23. And the ones that we're talking about space, we're talking about how do we manage the interference between the traditional geostationary communication satellites and all of these new non-geostationary, NGSO is the work term for that, or those what we think is the mega constellations, right? The Starlinks, the Kuipers, the Iridiums. So how do we manage the spectrum interference or potential interference between geo and non-geo? What is the proper orbital separation? And there's a typo there, sorry about that, for non-geo constellations. So if I've got a constellation at 550 kilometers, can somebody else put a constellation at 555 kilometers? Or does that have to be 560 kilometers or 565 kilometers? There's another huge fight over the potential interference and allocation of spectrum between satellites and terrestrial 5G networks. There is a strong push from a lot of terrestrial operators to get governments to take allocation of spectrum from space services and reallocate them for more terrestrial 5G. And then another big issue is the protection of the radio astronomy. We have telescopes that listen or watch in radio frequencies, not in optical frequencies, and they generate a lot of amazing science. But as there's more and more broadcasting and more spectrum, it is more difficult to have those telescopes do their job. And then finally, one other major concern that's come up recently is light pollution. And I think some of you may have actually seen one of the infamous Starlink trains, or the dots of newly launched Starlinks as they go across the sky. That is going to be happening more and more, and that is having an impact on astronomy. So this is an example of a series of photographs taken over time by a telescope in Chile, and the diagonal streaks are Starlink satellites that, of course, interfere with the astronomy that's happening. So that's just a quick tour de force of the major problems we're after. So now what are we doing about that? And the answer is there's a lot of things going on. So first, I just want to recap and talk a little bit about the international legal framework. Under the Outer Space Treaty 1967, each launching state is responsible for authorization and continuing supervision of their national space activities. And those space activities include both the government's own activities and the activities of their private sector entity. Each launching state is also liable for damages that their space activities cause. If those damages are to people and property on the ground or to aircraft in flight, there is absolute liability. So if you launch a rocket, the rocket explodes, and parts of that rocket hit an aircraft or land in a city, those damages, that state is absolutely liable for that. If there's damages to another space object, you collide with a satellite or a piece of your debris hits a satellite, there is liability based on fault. And to date, there is no examples of that. We haven't had any court cases. So a lot of this gets into now we're starting to talk about, well, these basic rules and principles are out there, but what do they mean? How are they interpreted? How are they actually put into practice? And I just wanted to note here that nation states are key to managing space sustainability challenges. The United Nations is a authorization and without the multilateral initiatives. The one that is to deal with these issues, the one that has been around the most is what's known as the International Guidelines for Orbital Debris Mitigation. Debris mitigation are steps that you can take to limit how much new orbital debris is created by activities in space. That includes launch, that includes activities on orbit, and re-entry of objects. There is so there's something called the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, the IADC, which was created by several major space agencies, and now there is a large group of space agencies that are members and contributing. And they contribute technical studies, they contribute science, and the IADC has collaborated to publish a set of standards for how to do orbital mitigation that all of those space agencies have contributed to. Those standards were first developed in 2007. They have been revised a couple of times, including most recent, I believe, 2021 or 2022. And the key point to remember is that those standards are voluntary at the international level. There is no international treaty that obligates countries to follow them. But a fair number of countries have voluntarily followed them and are implementing them through national policy, standards, legislation. For example, here in the United States, we have a national debris mitigation standard that is very similar to the IADC standard. And then all of our federal government agencies have regulations that implement those standards for their missions. And then the agencies that license commercial activities, such as the Federal Aviation Administration or the Federal Communications Commission, have also implemented those standards in their licensing. There is sort of an extension of this that has happened recently, which is coming out of the European Space Agency, ESA. They have recently put forward what they call their zero debris approach. And that says that reducing or mitigating the creation of new debris is not good enough. We think that the goal should be zero new debris by 2030. And ESA has put forward a set of standards and recommendations for how to do that apply to ESA member states and also their national activities. ESA has also developed what they call a zero debris charter, which is a set of voluntary targets and some political commitments that is open to anyone to come join. And they hope that'll help spread more international commitment to this. There's a question in the chat here about Russia, China's debris contribution. I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but I'll say that both Russia and China, Roscosmos and the Chinese National Space Administration, CNSA, are members of the IADC and contribute to those studies at the scientific and the technical level. Both Russia and China also have national debris mitigation standards and some level of implementation. They have different systems than we do in the United States, so or in other countries, it's hard to make that comparison. But they are involved in these discussions, and I want to follow up with this when we get back to the Q&A. So that was sort of the beginning of all this, was talking about debris mitigation standards. We then go to the next phase, which happened within UN COPUOS, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is the main UN body that deals with peaceful uses of outer space. As I mentioned, I'm headed there next week for their scientific and technical subcommittee. And in 2010, that technical subcommittee started work on what became the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. This was an initiative largely in part started by Canada and some of the people they had in terms of chairs that then became a nearly 10-year-long effort to develop these guidelines. And I think somebody's got their microphone open. And it was a long effort, and there were many reasons for why it was long. One of the reasons is this was a new topic for many countries that are part of the committee. When this started, there were roughly 75 countries that were members of UN COPUOS, and by the time it ended, there were more than 90 countries. So there were countries that for this which was new in the beginning, and then over time more countries joined, and it's new for them as well. You know, there was also a concern in the beginning from a lot of the global south and from the developing countries that these guidelines were efforts by the developed world to put roadblocks in place to prevent the developing world from catching up, from getting to where they are. And there was a lot of discussions and a lot of regional engagement around saying, no, this is about protecting the sustainability of space for everyone, because everyone, developed, non-developed, Western countries, global south, global north, everyone uses space. Whether you have satellites or not, you all use space. So there was this took a very long time, but in the end, in 2019, there were 21 guidelines that were agreed to by all 92 member states in UN COPUOS and then endorsed by the UN General Assembly. I'm not going to go through them, but they cover policy, regulatory, safety, cooperation, R&D. They cover a pretty wide variety of things. At the moment, there is a second version of this long-term sustainability working group, we call it, that is working between 2022 and 2026, and it is focused on reviewing and promoting the implementation of those guidelines that were agreed to in 2019, which is an important activity. So next week in Vienna, Austria, where these people meet, countries are going to implemented or how they are following along the 21 guidelines that were adopted in 2019. This LTS 2.0 working group is not chartered to develop new guidelines. And that's important because there are lots of things that the existing LTS guidelines do not cover. For example, rendezvous and proximity operations, satellite servicing, remediation. None of those things or were focuses as guidelines. So at some an effort, add new guidelines to this. There's also been years of what is called dark and quiet skies. And this goes back to the question about the radio, how all these new satellites that are broadcasting radio signals, how those are interfering with or could harm astronomy and other uses of space. That was a discussion point that was talked about quite a bit last year, but at the moment it's unclear if this dark quiet skies agenda is going to continue for 2024 and beyond, and it has to do with some complicated geopolitical issues that I can talk about in the Q&A. And to one of the questions, all of this is about space and the ground. And I think that's an important point to make. There's quite a lot of, all the radio RF spectrum stuff is talking about space and the ground, not just in space. And the debris mitigation that I mentioned earlier talks also about re-entering of debris objects, of making sure your satellite doesn't land in populated areas, your rocket stages don't land, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the major multilateral initiatives at this issue. I want to finish up here just going through some of the private sector initiatives. And the first thing I'm going to note at the top, there are a lot of them. It seems like every year, every 6 months, there is a new group somewhere in the world that is proposing a new initiative to deal with space sustainability. I'm not going to have time to go through all these in details. I'm basically going to quickly go through all of these. You're welcome to have the slide deck afterwards. I've hyperlinked in all of these websites and all these initiatives so you can find out more details. So quickly going through these. The Space Data Association, one of the original ones. It's a group of satellite operators who help each other do a better job of avoiding collisions and radio frequency interference. So they decided that the governments were providing was not quite good enough, and we're going to get together and help ourselves. The Space Safety Coalition is a group of companies and NGOs that have come up with their own best practices for sustainable space operations that go beyond what are in the IADC guidelines. So the government has set a standard at one level, and these companies and NGOs have said that they think the standard should be much higher and are pledging to abide by that higher standard voluntarily. CONFERS is something that I've been involved in. That Etem mentioned in the beginning. This is a industry association of more than 50 global companies that are all involved in satellite servicing, and they're working on best practices and standards. I was involved in the creation of that, and I served as executive director for several years. I stepped down as executive director last April, and it is now a fully fledged, fully independent trade association that is up and running with another Brian in charge, not this Brian. The Satellite Industry Association, which is a mainly US group of satellite companies, has a few years ago released their own principles on space safety for the commercial satellite industry. Again, it's sort of a pledge of these are the things that the government doesn't require us to do this, but we want to go beyond what is in the requirement. The space sustainability rating is a very interesting concept. It's sort of like if you ever walk into a major building and on the front of the building they have a gold or a platinum energy efficiency sticker on there. This is similar to that, but it's for space operations. Basically, it is a set of standards of scoring systems to allow companies to quantify and measure how sustainable their constellations are. And the idea of the rating is that it is a positive reinforcement of good behavior that then can be recognized by insurers, by regulators, and by customers to help promote those companies that are doing the right thing. There's also AIAA led a smaller group of companies, Iridium, OneWeb, and SpaceX, to develop a set of orbital safety best practices that apply to constellations and satellite operations in low Earth orbit that have some very interesting things focused specifically on those. In the last couple of years, the Paris Peace Forum has also gotten into this area. They have released what they call their net zero space platform, where they're bringing together companies and governments and NGOs to abide by and pledge steps to not only mitigate creation of new debris, but also remediate or remove existing debris. And that's something we haven't really talked about so far here. Because at the moment there's not a lot going on there, but it's one thing to minimize how much new debris you create, but there's all that existing debris that I mentioned in the very beginning we've already created that's going to be up there in many cases for a very, very, very long time and is going to pose a threat. So what do we do about not just not adding more space debris, but how do we get rid of some of the existing stuff? That is a very big topic and it's very complicated. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But at the moment, there are some minor efforts going on, but there's not a lot of major efforts going on. A few more private sector initiatives. One of them is something called the Earth and Space Sustainability Initiative. And this is coming out of the United Kingdom. And the goal here is how to develop environmental, social, ESG standards for space sustainability that can then inform finance and insurance communities. So how can we, sort of like what's happening with a lot of companies and businesses here on Earth that are putting out ESG policies, how do we develop similar things for the space environment and how space and the Earth interact that can have a similar function with the financial and insurance communities in the space sector. There's something called the Global Satellite Operators Association, GSOA, and they're sort of a global version of the Satellite Industry Association I mentioned earlier. They also have developed what they call a code of conduct for space sustainability. And again, this is a set of best practices that goes beyond what the governments require them to do. And then also kind of very interesting, there's something called ACCRES, which is an initiative. It's something that has been launched by King Charles III as part of his Sustainable Markets Initiative. And ACCRES is, you know, it's a play on the Magna Carta, which is one of the first, you know, treaty legal documents, sort of formulating principles of a government. And the idea is to lay out some principles and a path for sustainable practices that brings together both governments and the private sector. This was just launched last year in relation to an event that Secure World Foundation did, our Summit for Space Sustainability, and it'll be very interesting to see how that evolves over time. So I want to conclude here just by putting up a few challenges, and then we can talk about these more in the Q&A section. There's a lot of things we still don't know. One of them is what is this issue that has been come to emerge when those carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, a term that is used a lot in economics and environmental management. Is you know the carrying capacity of a road. How many cars can a road sustain before it just breaks down, either from wear and tear or from congestion and you get gridlock? That's a pretty good example. So is there a carrying capacity of Earth orbit? Is there a limit to the number of satellites we can put into space or in a certain orbital region? The answer is we don't know, because it's really complicated. And there's many different ways to measure and think about it. There's a lot of different groups around the world that are doing science on this question, but right now there's not any real firm answers. So that's something really important to continue to study. The second challenge is, you know, I've talked a lot about sustainability of Earth orbit and how the Earth orbit impacts the Earth itself. What about sustainability of cislunar and lunar space activities? There's a lot of companies and governments that are going to be launching landers and robots and vehicles that are headed towards the moon. And how do we do things like debris mitigation in lunar orbits when there's no atmosphere to clean things out or slow things down so they re-enter safely? This is an area where there's a lot of ongoing work, and we really don't have any existing standards. Another set of unanswered questions is the impact of space on the Earth's atmosphere. Rockets go up through the atmosphere, space debris and re-entering objects come back down into the atmosphere. What are those impacts? Traditionally, the impacts were very, very minor. But as we go from, you know, 100 launches a year to maybe 1,000 launches a year, and as we go from 100 satellites re-entering a year to 1,000 satellites re-entering a year, how does that change what those impacts are? like carrying capacity? The answer at the moment is we don't know. There is not a lot of good science and research on this. There are now people that are starting to look at this, that are starting to study this, but it's still an emerging area, and we honestly don't know if there's a problem, or maybe it's not going to be a big deal. We just don't know yet. And then finally, I'll say there's a political element to all of this, which is how do we overcome the obstacles imposed by what I'll call great power geopolitics? One of the reasons that the LTS guidelines took nearly a decade to develop is the political debates between mainly Russia and everyone else as a result of the first invasion of Ukraine back in 2016. As a result of that, the West put a lot of sanctions on Russia, and that ended up with Russia putting a lot of obstacles into this process because it was a consensus process where all the countries had to agree to move ahead. And we're still seeing a lot of this happening. I mentioned the dark and quiet skies issue that may or may not be an agenda item going forward. That is due to some debates between Iran, Russia, and the United States. There's a lot of this going on, and all of the multilateral fora and organizations are having challenges with how to manage this great power geopolitics that's creating some gridlock. So that is something that we have to deal with. There's also the question about what is the role of the private sector. Obviously, the private sector is a huge actor in all of this and is not represented in things like UN COPUOS, which is only states. So there's lots of questions about, should the private sector have a voice in some of these questions? How does the private sector engage with governments? How does the governments, satisfy their supervision authorization requirements out of the treaty? These are all things we're still trying to work out. I'm going to conclude just by mentioning that I mentioned we had our Summer State Sustainability last year. It was in New York City, and that's where, in relation to that, King Charles rolled out the ACCRES initiative. This year, our summit is going to be in Tokyo, Japan, July 11th and 12th. If it's possible to come in person, we would welcome that. We're going to have a lot of in-person discussions, but we're also going to have a significant virtual component. So there is an opportunity to not only listen to the panel discussions and the speakers, but also there's going to be an ability to interact and ask questions for our virtual participants. So if you want to find out more information, you can go to swfsummit.org to find out more information and to register. So with that, I will conclude, and I'm more than happy to talk through anything and to get to some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat.
Thank you very much, Brian. This was very exhaustive, and a couple of questions are already in the chat. But before we respond to that, one of the things that kind of has been bothering me is, just like you've enumerated, so many frameworks are out there by governments, intergovernmental organizations, by private sector, but there's still the issue of enforcement and the issue of liability. And I remember you and your colleague, Victoria, actually wrote a paper sometime about, is it time, it was like a question, is it time to move from non-binding frameworks, as you've mentioned, to something that is more binding? What's your position? What's your thought about that?
Yep. So that's a big question, right? Some of these key things, almost all of these things that I mentioned, sustainability, all these initiatives, nearly all of them are voluntary. And look, at the moment, we can't force countries to do anything, right? Countries have to volunteer to be bound by a treaty. And there are certainly, while there are some countries that have said they are interested in some binding agreements or some binding limitations on things like orbital debris or other aspects, there are many other countries that have said they're not open to that. So for the moment, there is not really a prospect for anything binding happening in the international system. Now, I didn't talk at all in this lecture about the security, military aspects of space. but it's this very similar dynamic. There has been a strong movement in the last year or two on anti-satellite testing, so destructive anti-satellite testing. The United States has led a voluntary moratorium, saying we're not going to do that anymore. That a couple dozen countries have signed up to, and there's more that are coming along fairly often. But that is a voluntary political commitment. I think there is room, or there is a pathway to turn that into a binding legal agreement, but there's a lot of work that would need to be done to get there. But on the debris, on the sustainability stuff, you know, the ITU's decisions are binding. So if the ITU creates a new allocation or does something, some of that is binding. But enforcement, you mentioned, is a huge challenge, right? One of the challenges with the ITU is, while it can create allocations, it has no enforcement powers. The enforcement powers are deliberately left up to the states. So again, a lot of this comes back to the willingness of the states to bind themselves or to hold each other accountable, which is a very difficult problem.
Yeah, thanks very much. And just to also mention that this webinar is part of a series, and Brian has actually taken a seminar in this series before, where he talked about the threats of ASATs and what to do about them. Just one more question from my end before I go to the questions in the chat box. And that, again, these frameworks appear to kind of deal with, is trying to handle the future, so to say, like on the issue of space debris, how to prevent further space debris. In particular, you mentioned the ESA zero debris approach.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens to what is already out there right now?
Yep.
What can we do about what can we do about the current problem? Because of course, some of us may have heard about the Kessler syndrome, which is likely
absolutely right.
So what do we do? Especially, and of course, there's the technical issues, but there's also the legal issues now. How can we tackle both?
So, that gets to the debris removal, or the more technical term is remediation that I mentioned. And it's not just removing. There's some other things you can do. But I'll say off the top of my head, that is not a technical problem. The problem there is the economics and the political willingness. Nearly all of the existing debris in space was created by governments, mostly US, Russia, China. Something like 90% was created by the US, Russia, and China over the last 50 years. It's not the private sector created a very small amount of it. So if you're talking about the stuff already up there, that is mostly created by the governments and basically US, Russia, China. And the question is, how do we motivate them to do something about it and help clean it up? Unfortunately, that means they're probably going to have to pay to clean up their stuff. And so far, none of those governments want to do that. And there, there's been some discussions about some experiments, some technology development to maybe get gets the ability, but so far none of them have really said, no, we're going to go ahead and do this. The countries that are the most down that path are Japan, the United Kingdom, France. All of them, and by France, I should also put in there the European Union. They all have funded technical demonstration missions to go remove a piece of debris, which is good. That is going to take the technology from we think we can do this to yes, we can do this. But no country has said we are going to put up the money to remove our debris. And so that's the big problem. It's political willingness and it's economics. There may be a situation in the future where companies are generating a lot of debris. That has not happened yet, but that would be a different situation. But for right now, the question is, how do we motivate those governments to do something?
Thank you, Brian. Let me bring up the questions in the chat box. you've already touched on the question regarding Russia, China. So I just go straight to the question by Perex. That's when we talk about space sustainability, what comes to mind is usually outer space. What about the ground segment? Is there any extension of the concept towards ground segments?
Yeah, so we touched on that a little bit. So all of the radio communications, all the radio frequency congestion issues, that absolutely involves the ground, because one of the debates is what, should this spectrum be allocated for space to ground, or should it be allocated for ground to ground, right? Should we use it for the next 5G cell phone network, or should we let it still be used for satellite communications? There's a big issue there. I mentioned briefly, but talk about, there's also a big issue of re-entering space objects, right? The more stuff we launch into space, it all comes back down. There's lots of concerns about when you initially launch a satellite, the upper stages that drop off the rocket, and even the one that puts the satellite in orbit, will re-enter pretty quickly. And there've been multiple countries, the Philippines comes to mind, but also some countries in Western Africa that are very concerned about rocket stages and satellites landing on their populations. And so how do we deal with that? That is a big part of this discussion. And then I also mentioned it's not only ground, so the atmosphere, that there are some concerns about what is the impact on the atmosphere. At the moment, the answer is we don't know. And like I said, there's a bunch of science going on about that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you responded to the question by Natasha. Earlier on, you mentioned that some of the reservations that developing countries are bringing up. It appears when we talk about space sustainability, countries in the South feel the Western world or the developed or the advanced space-faring countries are trying to put roadblocks on their efforts to utilize space. And so Natasha is talking about in terms of space capability, what is your sense of the current capability of people, skills and systems in achieving targets and future possible trends?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mentioned this was a really big issue during the original LTS discussions. There absolutely was a perception by the developing world in the global South that there was a concern that these LTS guidelines and these standards were going to be roadblocks put in place by the rich countries. That was not the intent. And one of the interesting questions was, my country does not have a satellite. Why do I care about space sustainability? We got that a lot. And the answer is, you may not have a satellite, but I can guarantee you use satellite applications and satellite data. You use it to monitor your crops, you use it to monitor your people, your borders, you use it for weather forecasting, you use it for navigation. You absolutely use satellite data, even if you don't have any satellites. And it's about preserving that ability to use those. You're going to help improve the socioeconomic index for your country, and in the future, still have the ability to develop your own space program. So that we're not saying, sorry, no more space programs. There's too much stuff in space, right? And there's now a lot of countries that are starting up smallsat, CubeSat programs as part of their STEM workforce development, and in part of trying to build up their economy. They're working on their own space programs. So there was a lot of work done to help make the conversation more inclusive and bring in those perspectives. I would say the original LTS, and again, I was involved a little bit of that as an observer, did a fairly good job of that. There were a fair number of global South countries that were participating, but we could definitely do a better job. And one of the issues is capacity building. How do we get countries more opportunities to engage, and also more how do because a lot of these countries, I'll take example, even Canada, right, which we think of as a rich country, but when it comes to space policy, they might have like 10 people that are doing that in the whole country, right? And so even for some of the rich countries, they had a challenge in just how do they get enough people that are knowledgeable about these issues to engage, but more importantly, how do they have a national policy process that can develop their national position that then they can engage in the international discussions. That was a huge challenge for many countries, and I think still is a question. So to me, that is something that we could probably focus on a little bit more, particularly in Africa, is how do we do some regional awareness, regional outreach to build up the capacity of African countries to be able to bring their perspectives and their interest to these ongoing discussions.
I think you've more or less touched on Natasha's second question about Africa's participation in these discussions. You've talked about capacity building, which naturally will empower those countries to participate in the discourse. So I'll just go straight to Jordan's questions, which is, can you discuss the areas where the US may be slowing down great power collaboration in space, maybe embargo on NASA working with China or the Space Force?
Yep. So, certainly the U.S. has its challenges when it comes to this. It mentioned the embargo and it's working a challenge. That's actually a law here in the U.S. The U.S. Congress has had a law in place for more than 10 years now, which prohibits NASA from bilateral cooperation with China without asking for permission from Congress. And our executive branch agencies are not always keen to go ahead and ask permission from other people before they go do things. So that has led to challenges in the U.S. cooperating bilaterally with China. However, there's no imposition on multilateral cooperation, and the United States, China, do talk and do engage in UN COPUOS. They do talk and do engage in the ITU and in many other multilateral settings. So there are some areas to be able for them to coordinate together, which is important because for all of their geopolitical concerns and security issues, both are going to be operating in space together. So there needs to be at least some level of discussion about how to do that safely. Space Force, we didn't really talk about military issues here. I'll just say that the U.S. military has been trying to talk to China for several years now on a range of issues, going from hard security questions to just military exchanges to also kind of coordinating or at least exchanging information on activities. The answer from China has been no, and has been silence for several years. And that has mainly been a policy decision. The Chinese government has essentially said, we won't talk to the U.S. military until the U.S. changes its policy on this. I hope that is going to change in the future, because even when countries are competing with each other, they still need to talk to each other, particularly about making sure everyone stays safe in space. So that is the challenge. I'll just say, look, U.S. has its challenges, but this is a two-way street, and it involves not only the United States coming to the table, but also China coming to the table.
Thank you, Brian. Just a final question as we round off, and that is just like you mentioned, the COPUOS S&T subcommittee meeting starts on Monday next week. What are you going there? I mean, what are your expectations? Sure. What are you going there to? I mean, your positions. What are your thoughts? Just generally, sure. Let's know what to expect from there.
It's a great question. This is good. This is absolutely going to be one of the big agenda items. There are going to be countries that are going to be reporting back on how they are implementing the existing LTS guidelines. There's going to be a workshop on Tuesday of the second week, talking about the space sustainability and the LTS guidelines and what is currently happening with implementation issues. So I'll be sitting in on that a little bit. There's going to be meetings of that LTS 2.0 working group that I mentioned, where they're going to be, again, focusing on implementation of the existing guidelines. Hope to find out what's going to happen with the dark and quiet skies agenda item. That's going to be debated early in the week as to whether or not that'll be accepted as an agenda item for this year. We're going to hear lots of countries talking about their debris mitigation efforts, and which is going to be really interesting. In general, and if people are interested, they can go to the website unoosa.org. If you go there, they're the secretariat for that committee. You can go to the SDSC and you can see the indicative schedule, agenda of work. There's statements posted by countries. There's a lot of resources actually to be able to listen in to what's going on there. So that's a general flavor of what's going to be happening there over the next couple of weeks.
Thanks so much, Brian, and we really wish you fruitful deliberations at the forthcoming meeting.
Well, and I'll just say, I mean, as an NGO, we're observers to the committee, right? So we get to sit in the back of the room and we get to, kind of watch what's going on, and maybe every once in a while they let us make a statement after everyone else has already said everything. So we're just on there.
So thanks, Brian, and we are going to continue this discussion. Like I mentioned, it's a series. So next month, we are going to look a bit more into the space debris issue. And then in March, we are going to talk about space weather, which is another thing that is of interest because of, I think we are approaching a solar maximum. So a lot of activities will be happening in this period. Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks everyone for coming. The recording is available. It will be uploaded on ASLI YouTube channel, so you're welcome to access it later. Thank you, and see you again.